First question really is where other political leaders have, if not rushed to their formal autobiography, have moved to it pretty quickly. So here you are 15 years later, and this is really your first substantial book. There was a much briefer one on foreign policy, but this is it really, and it's a collection of speeches. Why no formal autobiography?
Well, I've always had the view, do you really have to do all the work and then write about it too to be valid? Really, in other words, it's a bit like, the habit Chinese people have of taking a picture. If there isn't a picture, the event didn't happen, Yeah. It's a bit like the book. If there isn't a book saying what you did, you didn't do it. Whereas you look in this country, all these changes more or less speak for themselves. And a very important friend of mine, his name starts with K, I won't go, around the world said in a very deep voice, he said, "Paul, if you're any good, someone else will write about you."
Now I'm going to actually go back much earlier than the book, just at the start, to set the context, I suppose, to talk about the forces that drove you into politics from such an early age. What would you nominate?
I was always indignant, even as a kid. I was always indignant at that bounder and fraud, Menzies. That Edwardian dandy, not that it helped that we had someone completely hopeless as leader, that was Evatt, and then Corwell after, but my father and I would stand on the polling booth and I'd run around putting out the leaflets in the letter boxes in our square we had in our branch, and every polling day we lost, for a series of... So you had a lot of elections. You had, I think there was 54 and then 57, don't ask me to remember them all, 61, 63. They weren't all 3 years apart. There was a series of them, And the Labor Party just sort of, didn't have the... And yet you knew it was a party of good people. It was a party that represented the bulk of the people. And so there was that about it, that is... the other thing, of course, was... The other thing I was interested in was, of course, I've often said, Churchill, And even though he was an old Edwardian himself, but not a dandy...
Hardly a dandy.
And he was all substance. He was all tip and iceberg. not just tip. I thought, this is the game this guy is in. This is the game to be in.
Well, in fact, in your speech launching Graham Frudenberg's book on Churchill, you said, and this was 2008, 3 years ago, you said that the inspiration for my entry into public life and into the Labor Party itself came from Churchill.
Yeah.
I was attracted to him for his braveness, sense of adventure, compulsion and moral clarity. How old were you when you were thinking that?
15, 16, 17, yeah.
What were your mates doing?
My mother and father bought me a book for my 12th birthday. It was written by the English professor of history, Hugh Trevor Roper, H.R. Trevor Roper. It's called The Death of Hitler by H.R. He was the first one in the bunker in Berlin within 8 hours of Hitler's death. So, I was interested in things at an early stage, and of course I used to work in the Sydney County Council here in what's now the Queen Victoria building in George Street, and I used to go down to a couple of book dealers in King Street, including Berkelow's, who are still around, and I used to buy Strand magazine from the 30s. And Churchill used to write a monthly column in Strand magazine about all sorts of things, But these are the years when he was out, of course, so you'd have reminiscences of the First World War, but he mostly wrote about contemporary things and rarely about himself. So I had this sort of interest in him, and of course I'd read, you get to read the histories. So Graham asked me, because of my interest in him and Graham Freudenberg's interest in Churchill, he asked me would I launch the book. And of course I did, and I was pleased to, because of the... You see, the British Tory party hated Liberals more than they hated Labor people. Because the Liberal Party, the last Liberal government under Asquith, they displaced the Tory party. And the Conservative majority of 1938 didn't want to ever give the Prime Ministership to a bounder like Churchill. They thought he was a drunk and a bounder. Of course, Chamberlain collapsed, and they would have loved to have given it to their favourite guy who was in the House of Lords. That was Lord Halifax, Edward Fox. But of course he didn't have to fight Hitler. So they gave Churchill the job, but there was a sort of an unspoken deal that part of the taking of it was he had to make the devil's bargain with Hitler. Because the British establishment wanted a settlement with Hitler, not a war. And when push came to shove, when they said, Winston, we want you to treat with Hitler, negotiate a settlement for the British Empire, he said no. And on that no went Western civilization, So you pay on the results.
You obviously very early, very smart, I would think, that it seems that from very early on you were looking for mentors. Is that right? I mean, the association with Lang is very well known.
No, I used to suck experience out of people. It's different from looking for mentors. This idea, do you have heroes? No, I don't have heroes. But I have people who people I admire. Churchill was one, of course, Roosevelt another, Curtin, Lang. But what I found was, in my young life, how do I truncate experience? How do I get the distillation of someone else's long years? Someone who can give it to you, someone who actually got it together and is not distorting it, And so from Lang I got, of course, he knew every figure. He was at Henry Parkes's rallies, and you name them, Edmund Barton or Fisher or later, of course, Hughes or Bruce or any of these people. Lang knew them all personally. So you got a pen sketch of what they were like, how they behaved and what their little foibles were and all this sort of stuff. So in the end, it filled in a lot of history, filled in. Of course, when you think about it, I knew Lang quite well. I used to see him twice a week for a decade.
And but when how old were you when you first started seeing him?
About 18. And I finished. I used to take him to schools at weekends, drive him to schools for high schools and things. But you get this connection. You see, here I am. This is 2011, but there's a connection through Lang, back through the early Labor Party, back to Hughes, back to Henry Parkes, and you can actually take the drift of Australian public life back that far, and there's a sort of a somewhat of a connection.
The remarkable thing is this to me, Paul, that you had no formal education beyond 15, yet you had an immensely curious mind. You obviously had a hunger for knowledge.
Yeah.
You had already developed an obvious interest in, and from what you're saying, a sophisticated interest in politics.
Yeah.
To be seeking these things out, where did that come from? Do you know that?
Just to find, I think, I used to always try and find out what is the sense of this? What does it mean? Like, for instance, when I first got elected to the House of Representatives, one of the first people I saw was a guy called Sir Lawrence Hartnett, Larry Hartnett. Oh, yeah. He was the builder of the Holden. Yeah, he was Alfred P. Sloan's point man in Australia for General Motors, and if you need if you need a framework to think about Australian manufacturing and the motor vehicle industry this is the guy, one of the guys to get it from. So I spent quite a bit of time with him. He used to have a house in Mount Eliza in Victoria, and I'd see him in Melbourne and have the odd lunch. And after a while, he was also head of the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation, which built Wirraways and then later Spitfires for the Second World War. So, you know, you had the motor vehicle industry and the aircraft industry, that part of the one we ever had, and so you end up essentially, and these people will generally tell you everything. You know, if you're listening, well, I mean, if you've got the antennae out, they will give you things. So Gough said to me one day, of course, you seem to have this fascination for old men. And I said,
you said as long as they're not too fascinated in me.
Yeah. And this is, of course, when I used to have a bit to do with Rex Connor. And I said to Gough, well, of course, if your Prime Ministership amounts to anything, Gough, I might have an interest in you.